Thank you very much. I've always admired his courage. Sometimes he's really crazy. But his craziness is exactly what's needed in this country, in this land. There are a million stories I could tell about thousands of experiences over the last 25 years in IPCRI. Probably most of them will go by untold. The hundreds and maybe thousands of people whose lives were affected by the existence of IPCRI, by us bringing them together, by giving them an opportunity to reach out, to listen, to understand, to challenge, and to be challenged. The hundreds, maybe thousands of human lives that we saved, literally, by enabling people to cross borders to get to hospitals or to get out of the line of fire during cast lead, on the phone late at night, with one telephone to the Israeli Ministry of Defense and another phone to a friend of IPCRI in Gaza whose family's house was shot at and children were wounded and had to be moved in an ambulance under fire. These are the stories that are really important, the ones that concern human lives and human beings, who, because there was an organization that was able to communicate and have trust on both sides, could do the kind of things that we did. That was never part of our main work. It was never the story of the meetings of the economist and the businessman and the strategist and the Jerusalem experts. It was really the story of the people, the individual people, who we were able to touch. I wanted to, at this probably my last and final event, speaking formally at an IPCRI event, give a little bit of historical perspective of how this all started and where we've come to since then, and maybe where we're going to in the future. In 1976, I was a student in New York City, and together with two other people, we approached the PLO embassy to the United Nations. Ambassador Zudi Terzi was the representative of the Palestinian people in the PLO in the United Nations. We asked to meet with him, and he heard that we were a group of Jewish students in New York, and he agreed to see us after office hours and let us into the PLO embassy through a back door. And we spent about 2 hours talking to him, in which time myself and two friends pleaded to him as the representative of the Palestinian people and the PLO to recognize Israel and to accept the two-state solution. Ambassador Terzi, who was an astute diplomat, was very undiplomatic in his response to our request. He said over my dead body, said, "We will never recognize Israel. We will never accept the two-state solution. You Jews should go back to where you came from." Deep in my heart, I believed and felt and understood that eventually the Palestinian people would come to recognize Israel and to accept the two-state solution, as I believed the Jewish people would recognize Palestinian rights and the two-state solution as a solution to the conflict. When I decided that I wanted to be involved in working for peace, I tried to begin dialogue with Palestinians and found closed door, basically a dead end, the kind of response that I heard from Ambassador Terzi. So I had no starting point, but I was relentless and I would not give up. And I looked around this country and saw the burning problems of the country. I thought the number one problem, which I still believe is Israel's number one problem, is the conflict with our neighbors. But I saw inside of Israel, 1/6 of the population at that time, 18% of Israel's citizens were Palestinian Arabs. So we didn't call Palestinian Arabs those days, we called them Israeli Arabs, or that's what they were called. And there was a problem of discrimination against them. And there was a problem of democracy. And I remembered very clearly the statement that Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, had made, that Israel would be judged by itself and by the world on the way that it treats its Arab minority. And I thought that was very powerful and meaningful. And I thought, as a citizen of Israel, as a Jew, it was incumbent upon us to make sure that discrimination didn't exist in this country between its various citizens, and that ethnicity, nationality, and religion is not a reason to discriminate against anyone ever. and we as Jews more than anyone else should know that. So I set out a course to work on the issue of what we called then coexistence between Jews and Arabs. I knew that I knew nothing, and I had to learn, and I had to get credibility. So I joined a program called Interns for Peace. I was the first intern for peace and interns for peace. And I went to live in a Palestinian village in Israel, Kufar Qara, for 2 years. Living in the village, doing community work, mostly learning. I learned so much more than I was able to contribute. I taught in 2 schools. I led a youth group that turned into a local youth movement that created a youth center that eventually sprouted out to be the community center of Kufar Qara. But mostly I learned and I listened. I visited more than 500 homes in the 2 years that I lived there. I kept a journal and notes. And I understood a lot when I came out there. I understood, for instance, that the State of Israel took no responsibility at all for ensuring that there was equality between Jews and Arabs in Israel. There was not one employee of the Israeli government at the time whose responsibility it was to advance coexistence and democracy between Jews and Arabs. So I sat down and do what I do. I wrote a letter to Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and I said, hire me. I want to be Israel's first civil servant responsible for Jewish-Arab relations. And I lobbied for it for 14 months, not accepting no for an answer until they hired me. It was a member of Knesset, an Arab member of Knesset, who found a budget line in the Israeli budget in the Ministry of Immigrant Absorption. They had created a program that no one had ever heard of. A member of Knesset, Mohammed Wattad, from the village of Jat, told me about this budget line, and I informed the Israeli government that they had a way to pay me. And then I was hired. And I became the first civil servant in Israel responsible for Jewish-Arab relations. And I was approached by Menachem Begin's office when a different German foundation approached the Prime Minister's office, the sister foundation of Adenauer, the Hans Seidel Foundation. And Hans Seidel Foundation had just established itself in Israel, and they asked the Prime Minister's office to suggest a program for Jewish-Arab relations. And I was asked by the Prime Minister's office to write a proposal, and I drafted a proposal to create the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence. And after several months, the proposal was accepted, and the foundation decided to fund the institute, and I was asked by the foundation to direct it. My condition for leaving the Ministry of Education, where I was officially employed, was that this institute be an NGO, but it be directly linked to the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Education. So on our board of directors, we had 2 representatives of the Prime Minister's office and 2 representatives of the Ministry of Education. And we had a budget to work on that the Ministry of Education didn't have to give me. And we began to work. The first thing I did in my first month of work was get the Director General of the Ministry of Education to put in the annual policy, the monthly policy bulletin of the Director General, the recognition of Jewish-Arab encounters that took place at Neve Shalom. Neve Shalom was new at that time. They were bringing youth together from high school, and that was the first policy decision that I got the Ministry of Education to do. Except I went on doing this work, knowing all the time that there's a limit to how far we could go in creating equality between Jews and Arabs in Israel, be creating true democracy in Israel. That limit was the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because until our conflict is resolved, Palestinian citizens of Israel will always be suspect, always. There is no excuse for discrimination. 65 years this state exists, there is no excuse for the continuing existence of discrimination between the Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel. It should not even be part of our discourse. Our discourse on the inside should be talking about partnership, about joint citizenship, joint ownership of this state, not about discrimination. That discussion needs to leave us. We need to demand that discrimination be removed from our vocabulary because it should be removed from our lives. That's on a policy level. I knew as soon as I detected there was an opportunity for changing what I heard from the PLO ambassador in 1976, that I would leave the field of Jewish-Arab relations in Israel and move to work on the issue that I really wanted to work on, which was the conflict. Well, at the end of 1987, the First Intifada broke out. And with the First Intifada, they began issuing flyers, political statements. And I was amazed by what I was reading. because the political statements didn't use the vocabulary of Ambassador Terzi. They talked about ending the occupation. They talked about creating a state of Palestine next to Israel, not in place of Israel. They talked about peace. This was coming from the United Command of the Intifada, which represented the four main political movements of the PLO, Fatah, the Communist Party, the Popular Front, and the Democratic Front. And after reading these flyers for several months, I decided I needed to go out and hear from real people what they were thinking. And one Saturday morning in March of 1988, I got on my little Vespa motorcycle and drove to the Dheisheh refugee camp. And I drove in. Wasn't a very safe thing to do in those days. There was a big fence in front of the camp because those kids would throw stones at the army vehicles going by. There were no bypass roads then. From the north to the south of the West Bank, you rode through Dheisheh. And I drove into the refugee school, the UNRWA school at the entrance to Dheisheh. And I took off my helmet. And in my broken Arabic, I was approached by some young people who said, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm an Israeli, and I came to listen to you. I want to understand what this intifada is about. I want to know what you're fighting for." And we stood in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, and someone said, "Yalla, let's go to my house." And I went to his house, and a house in the Dheisheh refugee camp at the time. It was a tiny little room, and about 30 people crammed into the room, and I spent 6 hours in Dheisheh that day, listening, talking. 30 people in the room. I came home buzzing with energy, because what I heard that day from those people in the Dheisheh refugee camp were not the words of the PLO ambassador in 1976, but what the flyers of this first intifada were saying. They were saying, "We don't want to destroy you. We're not telling you to go back to where you came from. We want you to get out of our face. We want to end this occupation. We want our freedom. We want our liberation. We don't want to destroy you." And I said to myself at that moment, what I was waiting for occurred. That moment of entry for dialogue based on mutual recognition happened. And I came home and I drafted a letter to the board of directors of the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence, resigning as director. I sat home and I drafted a little advertisement, and this is when I met Hannah Senor for the first time. I came to East Jerusalem to the offices of three main daily newspapers at the time, Al-Fajr, which was the leading newspaper at the time, Al-Shab, and Al-Quds. And I published an ad that said, "If you believe in the two-state solution, you believe that Palestinians and Israelis can work together for peace, call me." And I gave my home phone number. I didn't understand in those days what I know now. I published the ad on Friday thinking that that was the day when they sold the most newspapers. It's actually the day when they sell the least newspapers, but that was my Israeli cultural reference. The ad went in on a Friday morning. By Saturday night, I received 43 phone calls. I made appointments with anyone who was willing to talk to me. I sat for 5 days the next week in the courtyard of the American Colony Hotel, and I met with 23 people. In preparation for those meetings, I wrote a 1.5-page paper. And I wrote in that paper, this conflict is no longer existential. It's no longer a conflict of us or you. It's a conflict of us and you. And the question is how. And I wrote down that I thought that the conflict was really about 7 identifiable issues. The question of Palestinian statehood, the nature of its sovereignty, the delineation of borders between the two states, the physical link between the 2 Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, the future of Jerusalem, the future of the refugee issue and the rights of refugees, the issue of economics, economic relations between the 2 states, and the issue of water and natural resources. And I proposed to the 23 people who I met with when they read this page that if you agree that these are the issues in conflict, then we have begun essentially what is the first stage of conflict resolution. Agreeing on what we're fighting about. From all 23 people I met with, who came from all over the West Bank and Jerusalem, they agreed with every word that I wrote in the paper. And I said to myself at that point, if this is agreed between us, then we can begin to work together on how to resolve it. If we know what the issues are in conflict, we begin to think about how to resolve it. And I suggested to various people that I went around and talked to, what if we try to create a committee that would work on the issue of Jerusalem, that would work on economic issues, that would work on security issues and borders? And I suggested that we put the end up front. In other words, it's not a committee to discuss what is the solution. It is a committee which begins its work by accepting the two-state solution and figuring out how to get there. That was the premise on which IPCRI was built, which enabled it to exist, because we didn't argue about the solution. We began the discussion from the acceptance of the solution and then trying to figure out how to do it. And 25 years ago, when we started in these meetings, we didn't have the answers. We really didn't know how to resolve the issue of Jerusalem, or how to develop normal, productive, mutually beneficial economic relations between the sides. We didn't even know how much water was here and how it could be shared. I was reminiscing with my daughter yesterday. At one of the IPCRI meetings, we achieved for the first time in the history the exposure of the Israeli civil administration budget at that time. If you remember, before the Palestinian Authority, the civil administration controlled all aspects of life in Palestine: health, welfare, education, everything, and they collected taxes. And the claim was they were always profiting from that, not investing all the money back in the public. We got the government to publish that budget and discovered that they were lying. Surprise, surprise. That was the premise on which we worked. That was the premise on which we were able to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. It wasn't easy. On the Israeli side, I went to speak to a member of Knesset, Mati Peled. Some of you might remember him. He was a general who, after the Six-Day War, left the army and became one of the prominent leaders for peace in Israel, one of the first Israelis to meet with Yasser Arafat when it was illegal to meet with the PLO. And I went to meet with him when he was in the Knesset and told him about the idea for IPCRI, and he told me, Gershon, it's a great idea. Don't tell anyone you talk to me. He said to me, my door is always open. Anytime you need advice, come and talk to me. Don't tell anyone. We don't need another organization which is going to organize demonstrations on street corners that no one is ever going to see or care about. Your challenge to succeed is to bring the mainstream establishment to the table to talk to Palestinians. At the first economic working group meeting that we held in 1989, we had 2 advisors to government ministers, we had 2 members of the Bank of Israel, and another senior official from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. After several months of work, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called me in for a meeting. They brought me into like a storage room, and they told me, if you ever tell anyone that this meeting took place, we'll deny it. They started out the meeting by saying, why don't you change your name, Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information? I said, that's exactly the point. Israel-Palestine. We're not going to change the name, you're going to change your position. And they couldn't come to the IPCRI meetings, but they wanted to. They wanted to, but they couldn't, for political reasons. It was illegal to meet with the PLO then. In 1989, we created IPCRI UK. Dr. Ahmed Khalidi and Rabbi Jeffrey Newman got together with me and a group of Israelis and Jews and Palestinians in London, and we created a branch of IPCRI in the UK that facilitated meetings between Israelis and the PLO from 1989 until 1994. In 1992, we held a meeting of Israeli and Palestinian security officials to talk about how to deal with issues of security that we knew would emerge if the Palestinians were to take control of the occupied territories. At that meeting, the head of the Palestinian delegation was on the phone every other hour to Yasser Arafat, who was sitting in his headquarters in Tunis, together with another advisor, Mamdouh Nofel, who was sitting with him, receiving the phone calls and transferring messages back and forth to the PLO team that we were sitting with. Mota Gora, who was former chief of staff, told me that the thing that pushed Yitzhak Rabin to accept the Oslo secret talks that were going on was the report that he received from Shlomo Gazit, former head of Israeli military intelligence, who participated in our talks in London. That there was something that we could talk to with the PLO, that we could make a deal with them, that it could go forward. Those meetings in London and were convinced Rabin to give a green light to Peres and Yossi Galen on the Oslo talks. These are the secret, unknown history of IPCRI. There are lots of highlights that I could go through every year. In 1994, Robin Twite joined us as he was working in the Hebrew University and came up with the idea that we should work on the issue of environment as another cross-boundary issue. And from 1994, over the next 3 years, we held an annual conference, bringing together Israelis and Palestinians on the issue of environment. The leading organization today that deals with the issue, Friends of the Earth Middle East, was born at the first IPCRI Our Shared Environment Conference. We published the first book on our shared environment with articles written by Israelis and Palestinians, and we brought those people together. And our water working group came up with the first models for water sharing. And in 1990, we held the first academic Israeli-Palestinian International Academic Conference on Water in Zurich. We repeated that 10 years, more than 10 years later, in 2005, with the second conference attended by hundreds of people, Israelis and Palestinians. At that first conference in 1990, all the Palestinian presentations were political about water. There was no one amongst the Palestinians who had any technical knowledge of water. It was all politics and human rights, which was important. In the conference we held in 2005, the second International Israeli-Palestinian Conference on Water, 90% of the Palestinian presenters gave technical papers on hydrology and geology and water management. And you saw the progression of knowledge as it had developed throughout those years, and the way that it came together with Israeli and international experts and added a lot of information. I would say that one of the things that we accomplished over these years was to create a large pool of expertise. That was one of the things that we did. People coming together to learn from each other. Lessons, looking at the future. What do we learn? What do I learn from the experience that I can share from you? One is that I think we've tried to represent always, a commitment to real peace. Not phony peace, not imaginary peace, but real peace. Meaning that it has to be comprehensive. Meaning that it has to deal with all the issues. Meaning that you can't negotiate peace and leave Jerusalem and refugees off the table because it's difficult. We've always believed that you got to put the difficult issues up front at the beginning and deal with them and not bury them. The commitment to real peace meant that we never accepted the notion that they are there and we are here and we build walls between us. Our vision of peace was an economic union, of cooperation, of people crossing borders, of open societies, of learning to celebrate the diversity that we're blessed with in this land that instead we treat as a curse. We have always objected to occupation. As a fundamental principle, occupation is non-acceptable. And if anyone accuses IPCRI of being a normalizing organization, as some people tried to do to prevent this meeting from taking place today, we say no. We have never accepted normalization with the occupation. Never. We bring Israelis and Palestinians together because we are opposed to the occupation and we demand that it end. Palestinians must be free and liberated from the Israeli occupation. And the Israelis must be liberated from themselves as occupiers. There's no compromise on this issue. We have always defined the end game up front. I already said that. I think it's important now. You want to bring people together to talk about how to create peace? The end game is up front. Not let's talk and see where we go. The end game is up front. You figure out how to make it work by doing the reverse engineering. Not the engineering toward the end game, up front and reverse engineering. We focused on innovation in ideas, putting new ideas on the table, controversial ideas. Let people knock them down. Let them be crazy ideas. The old stuff usually doesn't work. So it's constantly coming up with new ideas, new proposals, challenging people to think. I talked about creating expertise and bringing experts together. We believe in diversity. We don't need to talk to ourselves. We need to talk to the guys who don't want to listen to us. It's wonderful to sit in a room and pat each other on the back and how wonderful it is. For the Israelis, the challenge is to get the Likud folks into the room. to be able to talk to the government of Israel. I remember when Netanyahu was elected in 1996, the first time. We had a big discussion in IPCRI. What should our policy be vis-a-vis the Israeli government of Netanyahu, who we knew his goal was to end the Oslo process. And we came out of that meeting declaring, we're not in the opposition. Our goal is to influence what they do. That's our challenge. Not to oppose them, but to influence what they do. And that's what we went out and sought to do. Figure out how to make the iPad stay on. I think, I'm concluding. One of the great things that IPCRI has done, and I think this room is a symbol of it, and hopefully will continue to do it, is the ability to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. And to Riman and Dan, that's the biggest challenge of today. We went through the hardest times in the Second Intifada when we didn't have trouble bringing people together. People wanted to still come together. Almost every meeting we did in those days, we ended up having to console someone because someone was always getting killed. Our peace education, which was our largest program, we had 40 schools in Israel. We had more than 80 schools in the program, 15,000 students a year going through the program, hundreds of teachers. At the beginning of the Second Intifada, one of our Palestinian teachers, one of the first people killed in the Second Intifada was one of our Palestinian teachers. He was killed by mistake, if there's such a notion. They were going after his brother and they killed him. And one of our Israeli Jewish teachers was killed. We were at meetings, most of our meetings during the Second Intifada, we couldn't hold here. Physically, we couldn't bring people together. In 2003, people used to say the peace industry, they're always traveling abroad to these fancy hotels. In 2003, I was in Turkey 23 times for Israeli-Palestinian meetings. Every other weekend, I was in Turkey. Because we couldn't do meetings here, believe me, it was no luxury and it was no pleasure. It almost destroyed my family life. But that was the reality that we lived in. We continue to be able to bring people together. It's getting harder and harder. And it won't get easier. And that's the challenge of the young generation, to try and figure out how to do it. My word of advice is don't give up. When the hotel yesterday got phone calls threatening them about holding this meeting here, yes, I said, no, we don't cancel. We don't change the venue. If they're outside demonstrating against us, we'll be in here doing what we do. We don't take no for an answer. We continue doing what we believe in. We continue working. We are not normalizing. We are working against the occupation. We are working for peace. And lastly, we have to keep hope alive. So many Israelis and so many Palestinians lost hope. We have no choice. Israelis aren't going away. Palestinians aren't going away. Neither side is willing to give up their right for a territorial expression of their identity. No one, to the best of my knowledge now, even those people who declare themselves one-staters, are not really willing to give up control of their own part of the land. I hold firmly that the only solution to this conflict is one which ends the occupation, creates a Palestinian state next to Israel, with open borders and all that I've said, but is based on the idea that there are two people in this land who each have a right to self-determination. I hope and I believe that in the future, these two states will negotiate agreements between them that will give up pieces of their sovereignty to create a confederation, maybe with Jordan, maybe with other states in the region. That will happen, but it begins by creating the Palestinian state next to Israel, ending the occupation, and enabling people to determine their own destiny. We have to hold on to that belief, as difficult it is, as many enemies as we have working against it. Don't believe the lies. Don't believe the lies. All the settlements in the West Bank control less than 6% of the land in the West Bank. Physical, less than 6%. Area C is 62% of the West Bank. 90% of Area C is undeveloped land. The two-state solution is still viable. An independent Palestinian state is still viable. And if we want peace to be viable, That's the only way to get there. In conclusion, I wish Dan and Riman and Kas, our friends and partners for a long time, and other friends and partners of IPCRI who have supported us over the years, from the international community and from individual donors, to continue the work. Hannah and I are here. We're not giving up. There are lots of surprises on that road ahead. One of my surprises, of course, is the whole story of Gilad Shalit that we'll have to read about in a book. But one of the things that I learned about in this work is that the most important asset that we bring to the table is trust. We build trust. And by building trust, you can overcome all the difficulties. It's hard, it takes time, but if you can bring trust to the table, you can bring others to the table who don't talk to each other, who refuse to talk to each other, who believe there are no solutions, and you can find them. So, thank you very much.